Hello, Internet, Magic Man here again with episode 2 of how to play the Final Fantasy trading card game. We're just going to call it FFTCG still, but just in case you missed episode 1, if you're just starting out, you may want to take a look back at that, where we talk about deck composition, starter decks with some recommendations, and we go through card composition, showing you everything that's on a card that you're going to need. Now, again, for experienced players of TCGs or Final Fantasy in particular, I do apologize if I'm defining terms or over-defining terms, but these videos are supposed to be catered to totally new players with the assumption that you've never played a trading card game in your entire life. This is totally new to you, and you're starting with Final Fantasy. So today we're going to be covering a number of things. Now that we know what a deck is comprised of and how to make one, and how to determine all the information on an individual card, whether they be a forward, a backup, a summon, or a monster. Today we're going to move on and cover where everything is on your playing field, your turn order, and examples of getting cards out onto the field. How do you cast or summon or put a forward out onto the board? That'll wrap up today's episode, and then we'll move forward into episode 3, where we'll get into combat, priority, and a few other nifty tricks. So let's get started. First up, we're going to start with what your field looks like, the area on the table in front of you. A lot of you can buy play mats if you want to have the actual zones labeled out. Now, there aren't a lot of official ones out there yet from Square Enix. They were a little delayed, so but you can get them from tournaments and things like that, so it's all up to your personal flavor. Playing without a playmat will work just fine. Again, playmats and card sleeves are generally recommended to keep your cards in good condition as you're playing, but you can do without them if you need to. We're going to be assuming that we have just a general area in front of us, and I'll use some Final Fantasy art to simulate that playmat for us. Our deck of 50 cards that we created on our last episode is going to go in the upper right-hand corner of the playing field. This is going to be our draw pile. This is important for a number of reasons. On our turn, we'll be drawing cards during certain phases. Some cards will actually action us into drawing a card, or action our opponent into drawing a card, or discarding cards, as it may be. And some abilities will actually allow us to search for cards. Now, unless stated otherwise, search is a very particular term. It means to go to your deck, your draw pile, and search for a particular card. If a card's action allows you to search some other area, it generally references the specific area. Search your break zone for X and bring it back. When you see just the term search, that references your deck. No going to your break zone, no going to your damage zone, anything like that. Right below your draw pile is your break zone, and for a lot of you, you'll probably reference this as the discard pile. When cards are broken, that's the FFTCG term for its power being reduced to 0, its summon being spent. Anything that would cause you to discard a card technically breaks a card. I say technically because if we're being ultra technical about the term, if you have a forward that's power is 4,000 and you reduce its power to 4,000 through some type of summon, let's say, as an example, it moves to the break zone, but technically the card wasn't actually broken. Its power just resolved to 0. Broken would be more in line with that card attacked and ran up against a blocker that was stronger than it, and the blocker broke it. So if you hear people being ultra specific, that's why there is a specific definition for breaking. But generally, the break zone can be treated or remembered as just your discard pile. Anything that's spent, anything that dies, anything that is no longer being used is in your break zone. As far as the big portion of the playing field, let's imagine that there is a dotted line down the center of our playmat here. On the side on the top of your screen, This would be the side furthest away from you if you were actually looking at a table. This is where your forwards are going to be played. So when you actually get a forward out onto the field, they'll be up there on that top portion, closest to your opponent. Now, there's no limit to the number of forwards that you can have out at a given time, so at some points you may be jockeying for real estate up here since tables aren't endless, and so just try to make everything as visible as possible for your opponent. On the bottom side of this dotted line, the side closest to you, is where you're going to play your backup cards. Now, your backups are limited. You can only have 5 out at a time, and again, all the naming rules that we talked about in our first episode apply to forwards and backups. If something doesn't have that triple overlapping card icon, you can only have one version of it out on the field at a time. With only 5 backups, you're going to have to be careful in some decks on which backups you actually play, unless you have the ability to break your own backups through their own abilities or through other cards. For instance, some backups may give you the ability that if you dull them and move them to the break zone, you can do X. Well, that's a self-breaking backup. So if you ever needed to free up a backup slot, you could pop that action ability, dull the card, put it in its break zone, and perform the action and now have a backup slot. So there are ways you can manage that, and we'll get more into that when we actually get to gameplay, but just know that you can only have 5 out at a time. Monsters are a bit of a weird mix here. They don't really have a dedicated place, per se, on your field. Generally, most people put them around that dotted line, so almost right in the middle, and favor towards the right, over by your draw pile and your break zone. Most people aren't going to complain too badly if you want to put them somewhere else, but they are things that you want your opponent to be able to see very easily. And actually, on that note, your entire field should be visible to your opponent at every single time. I know when I play personally, I have a tendency to rest my forearms on the edge of the table while holding my hand. Now, if I don't have a hand, I generally don't do that. I sit back. But if I have a hand of cards, I generally lean forward a little bit. And what I've realized subconsciously after watching this a bunch of times play out is that by doing that, I tend to obscure my backups from my opponent's view. And in most cases, that's not going to be a big deal. My opponent, if they're familiar with Final Fantasy, the trading card game, they've probably seen these backups before, and they know what they do. But I always it bugs me in the back of my head that I have to be very cognizant not to, particularly in tournament play, not to be leaning forward on the table and obscuring my backups, because it could come off as maybe I'm trying to hide an ability that one of them has that I don't want my opponent to see. That's not the case. I'm just dumb. So just be cognizant that your entire field should always be visible by your opponent as well as you. The last area on your field we'll talk about is on the left-hand side of your mat, running pretty much from top to bottom, and that's the damage zone. As mentioned before in episode 1, when you take damage in Final Fantasy, you take a card off of your draw pile, turn it face up, and put it in the damage zone. It's a lost card. It's random. You can't use it. You're never going to get it again, and you're not going to search your damage zone for very many things. So, unfortunately, it's gone. You do get the benefit of, if it's an X-Burst, you get to pop that ability at no cost, but you took damage and you lost a card that could be a very valuable card to some synergies in your deck, so you want to stay away from taking damage as much as you can. Now, these cards are generally stacked in a little descending pile. Most people put them sideways. I've seen people put them vertically. Again, you're doing it so that the names can usually be read at all times by both players, so that there's specific card actions that might reference the damage zone, the break zone, things like that. And on that note, I do want to point out the difference between public zones and private zones. And again, don't be dissuaded here by how long my videos are. You can pick up the FFTCG and play it with a friend within an hour. Read that sheet that we referenced in episode 1, and you'll be playing, no problem. You may have questions. Some of the questions are things that I've thought to put in this video because they're questions that I had as a new player, and I constantly found myself jumping to the FFTCG Reddit for card rulings, or how do these 2 or 3 cards interact? Which one happens first here? So there's a lot of resources out there, and I know these videos tend to be a little longer, and I'm okay with that because I'm going into a lot more detail to save you all that searching later. Public zones denote any area that both players have access to. Both players have access to their own break zones, of course, their own discard piles. But they also have access to their opponent's break zone. That is a public zone. Your opponent is free to look at your break zone anytime they wish and flip through it, the same as you can do with theirs. Those are public zones. The damage zone is a public zone. Any of the players can look at the other player's damage zone at any time they want. And it isn't unusual for your opponent to want to see your break zone and flip through those cards very quickly. Some decks are very heavy with things that they can do with cards in the break zone, and your opponent might be aware of that and wanting to keep an eye on what's there at any given time to kind of guesstimate or make some educated guesses on what might be happening soon. So those are public zones. Any player has access to them regardless of whether it's your break zone, your damage zone, or your opponent's break zone or damage zone. The field is also obviously a public zone. Your forwards, your backups, and your monsters that have been played on the field are public zones. Both players have access to them. As a matter of courtesy, if you're playing with someone that you don't know at your local games shop, at your local tournament, any qualifiers, anything like that, as a matter of courtesy, I would recommend that you ask before you pick something up that is your opponent's. I know generally that can slow tempo down, so in some tournament scenes it may just be, a documented rule going in. You'll have to check that with your particular tournament, that if you want to see something, you are free to just grab it. But generally, I just ask, hey, I'm not familiar with that forward, can I read it? And pick up their forward and read the abilities. Most people aren't going to have a problem because you need to know what those cards do. So that you can adequately play against each other. Hey, can I flip through your break zone? No problem. Okay, great. Put it back. So as a matter of courtesy, I generally ask. In some situations, yeah, that may slow down tempo, and there may be rules set up ahead of time to keep the speed of the game going. Private zones are your hand. Only you can see your hand, obviously, and your draw pile, which is technically a private zone not only from your opponent, but also from you at most times. You have no idea what's in there in what particular order. You may have an idea of cards that you've seen 3 of already, so you know they're not in there. But generally speaking, you don't know a ton about your draw pile besides maybe what's left. You certainly should not know the order, and if you do, something's a little suspect there. So your draw pile is a private zone, as well as your hand. You can't see your opponent's draw pile, they can't see yours. Obviously, you can't see their hand, and they can't see yours. Unless a card's ability allows them to. And that brings up one key point. A lot of times, cards may violate some of the rules I'm giving you. I just told you the draw pile was a private zone, that your opponent doesn't have access to that. And generally, that's true. But certain cards may give them the ability to look at your draw pile, look at your hand. And I'm future-proofing these videos a little bit. We do have cards that let you look at your opponent's hand, so we'll keep that as the example here, where certain cards may force you to not only show your hand to your opponent, but allow them to discard a certain something. When a card violates the rules, the card always takes priority. So read the card's text and execute it, even if you know that generally that would violate some type of rules in print. Now that we know what the field looks at, let's move on to actually getting cards on this field. Alright, in video 1, we showed you in the upper left-hand corner that every card has some type of cost. You have to pay to get a forward out on the board. You have to pay to get a backup out on the board. You have to pay to cast a summon, which happens immediately, resolves, and moves to the break zone. You have to pay to put a monster on the field. How do you pay? Well, we also mentioned that you need crystal points, the number in the upper left-hand corner, and you need at least one of those crystal points to match the element of the crystal behind the cost's number. All right. How do we get crystal points? There are two ways. You can take any card from your hand and discard it directly to your break zone. This generates 2 crystal points of whatever color the card that you discarded was. For instance, if you discarded the Warrior of Light to your break zone to generate crystal points, you would be awarded with 2 fire crystal points, 2 fire CP. You're now free to cast anything that costs 1 or 2 CP, and you meet the fire requirement if you're casting something fire-based. One of the 2 CP has to be fire. Well, in this case, both are. You can now play your card onto the field. If it's a forward, set it furthest away from you. If it's a backup, set it closest to you and dull it. Turn it sideways. You are going to hear this term an awful lot from here on out. Dulling refers to using the card in some way. If it's a forward, maybe you're attacking. That would dull it. Turn it sideways. If you're using a backup for any actions that include the dulling icon, dull it. Turn it sideways. There's something else that dulls backups, but I didn't mention it there because we haven't gotten there yet. This indicates that the card has been spent. It will become active again on your next turn, but for right now, it's spent. Backups always enter the field dull. Monsters and forwards do not enter the field dull unless the card specifies some other reason why they should. And the forwards cannot use any ability on their first turn that requires them to be dull. So if they have some type of action on their card that says, dull this card, do this, they don't get to do that their first turn, and they also don't get to attack their first turn. They're suffering from summoning sickness, so forwards have to wait a turn. The exception is the keyword haste, which we will talk about keywords when we get into combat. The second way to generate crystal points is by using your backups. Not only do backups provide a slew of abilities that may help and assist your deck, but they can also be used to generate CP for you, 1 point per backup. Now backup goes dull, and you're awarded with 1 CP of the color of whatever backup that was. So if we had a fire backup that we dulled, we now have 1 fire CP. You can use this to start to mitigate the costs. Discarding cards to generate new cards onto the field gets very expensive and puts you in a situation where you're discarding cards that you may want later in the game or you want to hold on to respond to certain things your opponent may do. Well, don't get caught in that trap of discard, discard, play. Discard, 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 play. Get some backups on the field. Backups can be dulled for 1 CP of their actual element. So, we have 2 different ways to get CP. Now, I do have to point out here, everything is spent, or is generated and spent 1 item at a time. You don't get to mix and match. What do I mean by that? If you discarded 2 fire cards, you would generate 4 fire crystal points. Every card that you discard generates 2 crystal points. Doesn't matter what the cost on that card you discarded was. If it's a fire card, 2. If it's an earth card, 2 earth. If it's a wind card, 2 wind, etc. If you discard 2 fire cards and generate 4 fire crystal points, you do not then get to play a 3-cost forward and a 1-cost summon. No dice, that's cheating. 1 for 1. Generate, spend. Generate, spend. You can do it multiple times per turn, and we'll show you where when we get to the phases of your turn. But if you generate 4 and only spend 3, that 1 fizzles and goes away. You don't get to roll it over into something else. So be very strategic about what you're discarding and in what order you do things, and have some backups on the field so you can get that 1, 2, or 3 or up to 5 crystal points without having to discard. It's a lot cheaper to discard 1 card and dull a backup to get 3 crystal points to put a 3 crystal point forward out than it is to discard 2 cards to get 4 crystal points and put that same card out, losing a crystal point in the process. So your backups are important. Play backup light, an opponent may make you pay for that one. On this topic, there's one thing we do have to talk about. We've mentioned light and dark cards before, and how they have particular special rules. When it comes to the field, since we're talking about the field, let's go over the first special rule. Unless a card states otherwise, you're only allowed to have 1 light or 1 dark character out on the field at a time. Characters are your forwards, your backups, and yes, your monsters. They count as character cards. Forwards, backups, and monsters are characters. So if I have a light forward out, I cannot put a light or dark forward, backup, or monster, if such a thing ends up existing, out on the field until my current light character on the field is sent to the break zone somehow, or to my hand, or whatever, until he's removed from the field. There are cards that violate this rule, but unless you have any of those cards on the field that let you put in multiple light or dark characters, you're limited to 1, and not 1 light and 1 dark. 1 light forbids you from putting a light or a dark out. Since we're talking about generating CP here as well, it's important to note that while the backups that are light or dark can generate 1 CP by being dulled, generally it's a light or dark CP, but some cards will allow you to dictate the color that they generate, so read the abilities. If you discard a light or dark card, you get 0 crystal points. Light and dark cards can be extremely powerful, but an opponent can punish the hell out of you for having too many of them in your deck. And hell, it doesn't even require your opponent to punish you. A bad draw, getting you a lot of expensive and powerful light and dark cards in your hand, that's made your hand meaningless as far as CP generation. You're going to be sitting on cards or discarding and getting nothing out of it. So there is a very big give and take with light and dark cards. You're going to want to make sure that you put in your deck exactly what you want in your deck, no more and no less, so that you don't end up jamming yourself as far as CP goes, because discarding light and dark gets you 0. All right, now that we've taken a look at how to generate CP and where everything is on the field, let's actually take 1 turn to walk you through the order of your turn. Now keep in mind, in FFTCG, you are not sitting there still on your opponent's turn waiting for it to end. You are still very much involved and able to do things even when it's your opponent's turn. But to walk you through the phases of your turn, we're going to pretend that we've waited till our turn and we've started. There's a few different phases, so let's go through them. On the beginning of our turn, we will have our active phase. This is where we take any dull cards on the field and activate them, provided we're allowed to do so, that some other action hasn't forbidden us from doing it. We activate our cards by taking them from their sideways view and turning them upright. Yeah, you players of other games know this is a different term. I can't say it in conjunction with this, because I don't want my ass to get sued. Or other people's asses to get sued. I don't know how it would work. Moving on. Our active phase allows us to activate everything that we may have used during our opponent's turn or during our previous turn. Having done that, we'll then move to our draw phase. This is really easy. We draw 2 cards off of our draw pile. The only exception to this, because of course there's an exception. There's an exception to everything in this game. The only exception to this is the player that goes first. Now, whether you've decided that by rock, paper, scissors, flipping a coin, you call it in the air. It's tails. Yes, it's tails. I get to decide, do I want to go first or do I want my opponent to go first? The player that goes first on their first turn only draws 1 card instead of 2. From there on out, everybody's going to draw 2 cards during their draw phase. You'll then have main phase 1. Now, this is the phase where you are allowed to discard cards to generate CP, to play forwards, to play backups, to play monsters, to get things out onto the field. You are free to do this as many times as you have the resources for, and in any order that you want to that's going to be beneficial for you. For instance, putting card A on the field is great, and you want to do it first, particularly if in your hand you have card B that when enters the field makes card A stronger. Don't put card B down first. You want card A there so that it gets made stronger by card B's field ability. So you can strategize and plan this out in any order you want. Now, I did fail to mention one thing. At the beginning of the game, when you've drawn your 5 cards to start, and we'll cover more of this in the next episode when we actually go through a few rounds as if we were playing a typical game, you are allowed to mulligan once and get rid of your hand to the bottom of your deck and take a whole new 5. There's many reasons you might want to do that. I just didn't want anybody to think I forgot that. It doesn't quite go here, so we'll put it in the next episode where I'll talk about some reasons why you might actually want to do that. Anyway, back to putting cards on the field during main phase 1. As long as you have resources, you can continue to discard, play something. Discard and dull a backup, play something. And you can keep going as long as you have the resources to do so. You can stop at any time that you want. After main phase 1, you'll move to the combat phase. This is where you're going to take your forwards and attack your opponent, trying to do damage to them. Now, I don't want to get too involved in combat here. That's going to play very heavy in our next video. A lot of combat stuff going on in next episode. But I do want to tell you a few general things for those of you that have played TCGs in the past. FFTCG's combat works a little bit differently than some of the mainstream, more popular TCGs in the respect of combat is resolved one at a time. So if I attack with a forward and I dull it to indicate that I am attacking, we will resolve that combat. Whether you block it, whether we use summons and change the stats, whether you take damage, we will resolve that combat in its entirety before I then go on to another forward of mine and attack by dulling it, and the cycle repeats. We do this one at a time, not like other games that you may be familiar with where you trigger combat across your board and it's up to the defender. Now, the defender still has all the choices as far as what to do in FFTCG, block and what they're going to block with, take the damage, etc., but we're going to resolve it one at a time. So a little bit different than some of the more mainstream, more widely played TCGs. Once combat is resolved, we move to main phase 2. And don't get all tense. Main phase 2 is just the same thing as main phase 1. You can now spend resources to put forwards, backups, and monsters on the board, spend resources to cast summons, use abilities on the field that are going to benefit you in some way. I'm going to show you some tricks in a future video on utilizing main phase 2 to your advantage. And this generally applies in other TCGs as well, so even if you don't stick with FFTCG for some reason, and I hope you do, it's a great game, but even if you don't, I think there's going to be something for you in some future episodes that relate to strategy that aren't going to be exclusive to FFTCG. After our main phase 2, we have our end phase, and this is the period in time where any abilities that were end of turn specific gain 2,000 power until end of turn. Now those abilities go away. Anything that needs to resolve that's left over, that needs to be played out and seen through to its entirety. If you have more than 5 cards in your hand, you need to discard down to 5 cards. You can't, while during your turn you can have a ton of cards in your hand, By the close of your turn, you can only have 5 or less, so you have to discard some things. So think about that if you're sitting there in main phase 2 looking at 8 cards. If I don't do something, I'm going to end up just giving these cards to the break zone. So let's figure out something to do. At this point, any damaged forwards that were damaged from combat now restore their power to their full value. So it closes everything out and resets it, and then you turn it over to your opponent, who starts the cycle all over again. I'm going to give a brief example here of a first turn to wrap up the video. So we've started our game, and my opponent went first. So on their turn, they drew 1 card. But since I'm going second, I will get to abide by all the general rules here and draw 2 cards. So I don't have anything on the field right now, so there is nothing for me to do during my active phase. Nobody to undull or make active. Moving to my draw phase, I draw 2 cards. Now, for this example, we're trying to keep this very, very easy, and we're pretending that I don't even have a hand right now. For whatever reason, all 5 of my cards have vanished. So I draw 2 cards. And in my fire deck, I have picked up the Warrior of Light that we've used as our example for so long now, and I've picked up Belias the Gigas, a nice summon that can buff a particular forward for 1 turn and has the fun ability of letting me draw 1 card. Now, keeping this example light, there's not much for me to do here. Draw phase is over. I took 2. Going to main phase 1, I really don't have many options. I've got 2 cards here, right? Don't have many options. I want to get a forward out on the board. So I'm going to discard Belias the Gigas. Hurts me to do so because that could be a useful card. Maybe we'll use it in an example later. That generates 2 fire crystal points. I'm going to get to play my Warrior of Light out onto the field. Now, my Warrior of Light card does not have haste, which we'll talk about in combat. But that just means that he's summon sick, so I can't attack with my Warrior of Light this turn. That ends my main phase 1. I get to choose when that ends. Well, it's kind of been chosen for me here with no cards, but I'll end main phase 1 and go to combat. I can't combat because Warrior of Light has summon sickness, so I'll move to main phase 2, in which case I have no cards to do anything, and I'll move to my end phase, and I have nothing to resolve. No damage or no buffs that I need to take off, so I will turn it over to my opponent's turn. Now, that was a really easy turn. And you might say, hey, we skipped a lot of phases. But we didn't skip them. It's important to note that they did still happen. My opponent would have had plenty of opportunities to respond to various things if they wanted to, but it's early in the game. I didn't want to spend a ton of things. I didn't want to put a ton of resources into anything, and I didn't have many choices to make. So this was a relatively easy turn. And a lot of your turns may be exactly that. There are some turns that can get a little complex, combat that can get a little complex, but generally speaking, most of your turns will be pretty quick. A game of Final Fantasy, the trading card game, can typically go anywhere from about 5 to 15 minutes. You know, even tournament play in really long matches, I've seen things go to time and them not be able to finish best of 3, but 15, 20 minutes, your average game isn't going to be very long. So it's a lot of fun to get in a bunch of games. Well, in this episode, we have covered what our field looks like, where everything goes, how to generate CP to actually get cards on the field, the turn phases that you'll be using every single turn, in what order and in what you do in each. And then we provided one example of a little basic turn where we were able to discard to get some CP and put our first forward on the board. In our next episode, we'll be taking this all to its final few steps here on actually playing through the game, when you can cast summons, most of them anytime you want. We'll get to it, trust me, and we'll do some combat. But until then, this is Magic Man saying stay safe, stay out of the damage zone.